keeping a single chop moving in hot dripping without losing the crust, building a white sauce from the poaching milk before the fish went cold, knowing which cuts braised down to something worth eating. Those were skills nobody wrote down. Here are 30 simple 1960s British dishes for one. You never timed the chips, you listened. The sound of the sliced potato dropping into the hot lard told you whether the fat was ready. A vigorous spitting sizzle meant yes. A dull plop meant put the chips back and wait another 2 minutes. This was knowledge passed by standing next to someone who already had it, not by reading a recipe. Egg and chips was the simple meal the 1960s kitchen could produce for a single person. 2 or 3 medium potatoes, a knob of lard in the pan, 2 eggs cracked in once the chips were almost done and the fat was still hot. The yolk left slightly runny, the white set firm at the edges, the chips drained on newspaper because that was the done thing, and the newspaper kept them crisp. It cost almost nothing. It was eaten at the table or standing at the hob if the evening had run late. She made it look effortless. You have tried to replicate it, and it has never tasted exactly the same, which means something was in the making of it that you cannot account for. The tin key was specific. You slotted it into the little tab at the end of the sardine tin and rolled it back in a single smooth motion, and if you knew what you were doing, the lid came off cleanly with the oil still inside, rather than spilling across your hand. If you did not, the lid bent awkwardly halfway, and you needed a fork to pry the rest open, which was how you knew someone had not grown up eating sardines. The toast went on first, thick cut from a proper loaf, buttered while still hot so the butter melted in. The sardines were laid on top, whole or broken with a fork, the oil from the tin poured over, a shake of malt vinegar, salt. In a bedsit in 1964, that tin and that toast was Saturday supper for a young man or woman just arrived in a city and learning to feed themselves for the first time. Tinned fish had carried working people through rationing and beyond. It was cheap protein that lasted on the shelf and required no refrigeration, no preparation to speak of, nothing except a tin key and a bit of bread. It fed a generation without fuss, and now it sits at the back of the cupboard, mostly unopened. In the 18th century, somebody decided to call it Welsh rabbit as a joke, the implication being that this was what the Welsh ate instead of meat, and the name eventually softened into rarebit, which sounded more respectable. The dish itself was ale, strong cheddar, a knob of butter, a spoon of English mustard, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce, melted together slowly and poured over thick toast before going under the grill. The ALE was not optional. It was what stopped the cheese going stringy, the alcohol cutting through the fat and keeping the sauce smooth and pourable. In the 1960s, it was still the kind of dish a person could put together with what was in the kitchen without a special trip to the shops. You watched it under the grill rather than walking away, because the difference between bubbling and scorched was about 45 seconds, and once it went, it went. The person who taught you that never used a timer. They just knew, and the knowing is harder to pass on than the recipe. Pig's liver was the cut the Northeast preferred, cheaper than lamb's, with a stronger flavour that the sliced onions were there to soften. The onions went in first and cooked low and slow until they went translucent and began to catch at the edges, and only then did the liver go in, thin sliced, no more than 2 minutes aside, pressed down gently with the back of a spoon to check the resistance. If it felt firm, it was overdone. You wanted it just past pink, still slightly giving when pressed. Nobody who learned to cook liver in a proper kitchen used a timer. They used their hands. During the Second World War, offal was unrationed. You could buy liver and kidney and heart at the butcher when the chops were all spoken for, and liver with onions became the midweek standard for millions of households that would not otherwise have eaten it twice a week. The habit outlasted rationing by a generation. Garlic was frowned upon in most kitchens. This was before garlic became ordinary. The version she made had none of it, and it tasted right to you, and you have never been able to explain why anyone else's version falls slightly short. Bubble and squeak was the reason you never threw the leftover veg away. The cold mash, the boiled cabbage, the few remaining sprouts, everything pressed flat into the hot fat, left alone until a dark crust formed on the underside. That crust was the whole point. You had to resist the urge to move it. The name came from the sound it made in the fat, which meant the heat was right and the transformation was working. A thrift dish since the 18th century, born from the British refusal to waste anything cooked. By the 1960s, it was still alive in every kitchen that did a proper Sunday dinner, which was most of them. Served with cold meat or a fried egg on top, it was a complete meal for one that cost nothing at all, which, on a Monday, was sometimes the whole point. The dripping tin lived in the larder or on the cold shelf, a saved tin or an enamel pot, filled gradually from every roasting joint. The fat poured off while still liquid and left to set. What made it worth having was not the fat itself, but what settled beneath it. A dark, intensely savory meat jelly, the concentrated residue of the joint's juices, which the people who understood dripping scraped carefully onto the bread before spooning the fat on top. Salt. Nothing else. The toast had to be thick enough to carry it without going soggy. In the 1960s, the dripping tin was still a working part of most kitchens that roasted regularly. Not a nostalgic affectation, but a practical one. Fat being expensive and not to be wasted. The young who had grown up during rationing used it without thinking. The ones who had not mostly chose margarine. The dripping tin told you, quietly, which household you were in and which generation had run the kitchen. The gammon steak went into a dry pan, no fat needed, the rind on the outer edge providing its own. The rule was simple, and it was said once. You turned it once and only once. You did not press it down or check underneath every 30 seconds. You left it until the surface on top had changed from pink to pale at the edges, and then you turned it. The EGG went in beside it, cracked into the rendered fat, the white going opaque in the heat. By the late 1950s, improved curing methods meant supermarkets could sell vacuum-packed gammon steaks that lasted on the shelf. A Saturday night meal that felt like a treat without the expense of going out. The once-only turning rule was never written anywhere. You were told it once, and you either remembered or you learned what happened to a gammon steak that was turned twice. It began as a pot of salted water and ended as something so satisfying it felt like a trick. Macaroni cheese was the bedsit cook's alchemy, pasta costing almost nothing. A roux built in the same pot once the water was drained, strong cheddar grated in until the sauce went thick and glossy and smelled of something sharp and good. Catherine Whitehorn, whose 1963 Cooking in a Bedsitter became the survival manual for a generation with one gas ring and nowhere to put the salad, understood this was the dish that justified cooking in a bedsit at all. Rich enough to feel like a proper meal. Forgiving enough that a first attempt came out right. You put it under the grill if you had one, and the top went golden and blistered. If you did not, you ate it straight from the pot. It was the dish a certain kind of woman made for you when you were unwell. She appeared at your door with a pot wrapped in a tea towel, kept warm on the bus. That specific act of care has no real equivalent anymore. The oxtail went into the pot on a Sunday morning and stayed there until the afternoon, simmered in water with onion, carrot, bay leaves, and a pour of stout if you had it. The bones needed the thyme, not for flavor alone, but for the collagen in the joints and the marrow, which dissolved slowly into the broth and gave it a richness and a body that no cube or powder could replicate. You knew the soup was ready when a spoonful held a slight cling as it fell back into the pot. The fat was skimmed from the surface. The meat was picked from the bones and returned to the liquid. The soup was reheated and served with bread. In the 1960s, oxtail was still the affordable end of the butcher's counter, priced for people who had the time to cook it rather than the money to avoid it. What you got for that time was a soup that tasted of depth and effort, a Sunday afternoon's patience made edible. It fed you 3 times from a single pot if you were careful. The kidney arrived at the butcher's already singular and affordable. Lamb's kidney was the cut that had fed working people when everything else cost too much. By the time the Victorian kitchen got hold of it and added mustard powder, cayenne, Worcestershire sauce, and a splash of sherry, something remarkable had happened. A deviled kidney, in that particular combination of heat, acid, and savour, became something that belonged on a breakfast table in a proper house. That is exactly where it appeared through the 19th century and into the 20th. In the 1960s, it was still made in homes that kept the older cooking traditions, halved and cored and sautéed hard in a hot pan before the sauce was added and reduced around them. The smell was specific, liver-rich and deeply savoury, with the sharp edge of mustard coming through the fat. By the time the first Vesta curry packets appeared on corner shop shelves in the late 1960s, the deviled kidney had already begun its long retreat from the ordinary kitchen. The spice it contained had not disappeared. It had simply moved somewhere nobody expected. But if the deviled kidney belonged to the inland kitchen, there was a coastal tradition that kept its own counsel entirely. Potted shrimps came from Morecambe Bay in Lancashire, where the brown shrimps were caught from traditional flat-bottomed boats and prepared the same way they had been for generations. They were cooked, shelled, packed into small pots, and sealed under a layer of spiced, clarified butter, with nutmeg, mace, and a touch of cayenne. The butter preserved the shrimps and carried the spice, and the pots were sent by rail across the country to be sold in fishmongers and on market stalls. In the 1960s, a pot of potted shrimps at Sunday tea was a small luxury. It was eaten on thin brown bread and butter, the cold, spiced butter softening as it met the warmth of the bread. You tipped the pot onto the plate and it came out whole, a pale solid cylinder that you broke apart with a knife. She kept one in the back of the cupboard for Sundays. You have not seen a pot in a cupboard like that since she was alive. It arrived in Britain via the kitchens of the RAJ. An adaptation of the Indian dish khichdi, which combined rice with lentils and spices, it was transformed by the British colonial kitchen into a breakfast of flaked smoked haddock, boiled rice, hard-boiled eggs, butter and curry powder. By the 1960s, it had migrated from the Victorian breakfast sideboard to the weeknight supper plate, made by people who had never been near India, but who had inherited the recipe through some domestic chain that connected them to someone who had. The undyed smoked haddock was essential. The bright orange variety was cheaper, but it bled into the rice and turned everything an unappetizing colour. The curry powder went in with the butter at the start and briefly bloomed in the fat before the rice and fish were folded through. The result was a dish of two worlds: British fish, Indian spice, a combination that had no single place of origin and belonged, by the 1960s, entirely to the home cook who made it. You knew you had made it right when the rice was dry enough to separate, but the whole thing held together when you pressed it with a spoon. The Black Country made faggots from what the butcher had left after everything else was sold: pork heart, liver, fatty belly meat, minced with onion and breadcrumbs and shaped by hand into small, dense balls, each wrapped in caul fat, the lacy membrane from the pig's abdomen, which basted the meat in its own fat as it baked. In Yorkshire and Lancashire, they called them savoury ducks. The name first appeared in print in the Manchester Courier in 1843. The onion gravy was made separately, and the faggots returned to it to finish, arriving at the table dark, tender, saturated with a thick, savoury sauce. During rationing, offal was unrationed. You could buy liver and heart when you couldn't get a chop, and faggots fed families through the worst of it. They never entirely recovered their status once choice returned. The generation that had eaten them out of necessity moved on when it could. Only the people who had always loved them kept making them, and those people are mostly gone. Somewhere in the 1960s, in bedsits and small flats from Wolverhampton to Whitechapel, a tin of condensed cream of mushroom soup became a cooking ingredient rather than a meal in itself. You opened the tin, poured it undiluted over a chicken portion, a leg, a thigh, whatever the butcher had, covered the dish with foil, and left it in the oven for an hour. What came out was not technically a sauce, but it tasted like one. The chicken was tender, surrounded by a thick, mushroom-flavored liquid that soaked into the mashed potato alongside it and made everything taste considered, as though you had spent hours rather than 5 minutes. Catherine Whitehorn understood this perfectly. Her 1963 Cooking in a Bedsitter was full of exactly this kind of shortcut, things that used tins and stock cubes without apology. It was cooking for people who were hungry and living alone with exactly one ring. Nobody pretended it was sophisticated. It was just good and quick, and those were two things that mattered enormously when you were 22 and the week had been long. And if the condensed soup trick was about making something feel like a proper meal, the Vesta curry was about something else entirely, about a door opening. In the late 1960s, a cardboard box arrived in corner shops that changed what single people thought they could eat on a weeknight. Dehydrated beef or chicken, a powder sauce packet, sometimes a nest of crispy dried noodles. It was Britain's first mass-market taste of something foreign. You boiled the contents, added the sauce, and something appeared that smelled of spice in a way unlike anything the kitchen had smelled before. It was nothing like the curries being made by the Indian and Caribbean families who had arrived in Britain since the Windrush. Those were complex, built from fresh ingredients and real knowledge. But for a young person living alone in 1968, the Vesta curry was a first step. An imperfect one, a step nonetheless. The pilchard was the sardine's cheaper, larger, more strongly flavoured cousin, and a tin of them in tomato sauce cost almost nothing in the 1960s, standard in the store cupboard of anyone living alone on a small wage. Friday night, when money was thinnest, was pilchard night. The tin tipped onto hot buttered toast, the tomato sauce spreading across the bread, the fish broken up with a fork so nothing was wasted. Cornwall had been the heart of the British pilchard industry since the 16th century, exporting salted fish to Catholic Europe in their millions. By the 1960s, the industry had contracted, but the tinned pilchard remained, cheap, nutritious, and never discussed. The smell of the tin being opened, warm, fishy, tomato, is not a smell anyone forgets, even those who would rather. Brawn was made from a pig's head, split, cleaned, and simmered for hours with bay leaves and peppercorns, until the meat fell from the skull and the trotters gave up their collagen. The liquid was strained and reduced, the meat picked from the bones, packed into a basin, and the reduced stock poured over, left overnight to set into a firm, sliceable terrine threaded with pieces of dark meat and pale jelly. Eaten cold with mustard, pickled onions, and bread. In the working households of the North and Midlands, it was still part of the weekly routine through the 1960s, bought from the butcher or the market stall. The woman who made it from scratch who knew how long to simmer a head and how much salt the stock needed, was already becoming rare. What the butcher sold in a block was a convenience version of something that had once taken a whole day, a large pot, and hands that knew exactly what they were doing. In Yorkshire and Lancashire and the industrial towns of the West Midlands, tripe was not a curiosity, it was a staple. The lining of a cow's stomach, prepared by the tripe dresser and sold bleached white and part cooked, was taken home and simmered in milk with onions until tender. The milk was thickened with flour at the end into a pale, gently savoury sauce. The texture divided people, soft, slightly rubbery, unlike any other meat. Those who grew up eating it thought nothing of it. George Orwell had written about the tripe shops of Wigan in the 1930s. By the 1960s, they still existed. Specialist shops sold dressed tripe by the pound, a trade that had fed mill workers and miners for generations. The trade is almost entirely gone now. The shops closed one by one, and nobody reopened them. Spam arrived in Britain in American military kitchens during the war, and the British did what they always do with something new. They battered and fried it. The spam fritter is a slice of tinned pork luncheon meat dipped in flour and water batter and dropped into hot fat until crisp and golden. The chippy's last resort, the school canteen's Tuesday main course, the bedsit, cook's emergency supper. Eaten with chips and ketchup, no ceremony required. The tin had been a wartime necessity. Canned pork stretched rations and lasted indefinitely on the shelf, and by the 1960s, it sat in that particular British limbo between the food that had kept you going through hard times and the food you were slightly embarrassed about now that harder times had passed. Your father ate it without comment. Your mother fried it without ceremony. You ate it because it was Tuesday. You have not entirely forgotten the taste. But years before any of that embarrassment settled in, there was a moment when going out to eat felt like a genuine occasion. And at the center of that occasion sat a prawn cocktail. In the 1960s, the Burney Inn restaurant chain, founded by brothers Frank and Aldo Burney in the mid-1950s, spread to every British town and made the prawn cocktail their signature starter. Prawns arranged over shredded iceberg in a glass, dressed in salad cream mixed with tomato ketchup, paprika dusted on top. It became the aspirational first course of a newly affluent working class eating out for the first time in their lives. You watched the person next to you to know which fork to use. You leaned forward carefully because the glass was awkward and the prawns were slippery. It later became shorthand for NAFF taste. The people who ate it in 1965 and felt genuinely excited to be there remember it differently. Some of them aren't here to say so. It was created for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 by students at Le Cordon Bleu in London. Cold poached chicken was dressed in a sauce of mayonnaise, curry powder and dried apricots, prepared in advance for the official luncheon. By the 1960s, it had moved well beyond royal occasions, into sandwich shops, office canteens, and the bedsit refrigerator, wherever cold leftover chicken met someone who knew what to do with it. You made the sauce with whatever was in the cupboard, mayonnaise or salad cream, curry powder, and a few sultanas. Sweet, mildly spiced, eaten cold on bread. It was the first dish that introduced many people in ordinary households to cooking with curry powder at home rather than encountering it only in restaurants. That shift, the spice moving from the high street Indian restaurant into the domestic kitchen, began here, unremarkably, in a cold chicken lunch for a coronation. It became a supermarket staple. Most people have forgotten where it came from. Friday was fish day, and had been for generations. It was a habit from Catholic tradition that never left even households that had not seen a church in decades. Smoked haddock in parsley sauce was the Friday supper a single person could manage easily. The haddock was poached in shallow milk, the milk reserved, and then a quick white sauce was built from butter, flour, and that same warm milk, with parsley stirred in at the end. The undyed haddock, pale yellow and genuinely smoky, was better than the bright orange dyed variety that cost a penny less. It was served with boiled potatoes, with no garnish. She made it every Friday, and the smell of it, smoked fish and warm parsley, meant the week was almost over, which meant something she used to look forward to. The kitchen is quiet on Fridays now. The pork chop hit the pan with a sound that meant Tuesday, not Monday. Monday was cold meat, and not Wednesday, which might be something from a tin. Tuesday was the chop, a single loin chop, the bone arching up from the meat, the fat on the outer edge beginning to render and crisp almost immediately in the hot dripping. You pressed it flat with a fish slice to get the fat right against the iron, and the sizzling intensified, and the kitchen filled with the smell of pork fat caramelizing, which is one of the particular smells of the 1960s British evening. The mash was made separately, floury potatoes boiled until they broke, drained, worked with a knob of margarine and a splash of milk until smooth. Gravy came from the pan juices, with a little water and a shake of Bisto. That was it. That was dinner. It asked nothing of you. It gave you everything you needed. The whole process, from chopping the packet to plate on the table, took 25 minutes. Nobody makes a single pork chop on a Tuesday evening anymore. Not like that, with mash and Bisto gravy and nothing else. The rhythm of it is gone. The Lancashire hot pot was built for patience. Lamb cutlets or scrag end of neck, the cheaper cuts that rewarded slow cooking, were layered in a deep pot with sliced onion and root vegetables, covered with a tight-fitting lid of sliced potato laid in overlapping rounds and brushed with dripping before the pot went into a low oven for 2 hours. The potato lid absorbed the steam from below and crisped on top, and when you lifted it, the smell that came out, lamb and onion and slow-rendered fat, was the smell of Lancashire. Originally, the dish included oysters, which were cheap enough for working people in the 19th century to use as a flavouring. By the 1960s, the oysters had been gone for generations, priced out long before living memory. What remained was the patience, the understanding that some things could not be hurried, that the cheaper the cut, the longer it needed. You knew it was ready when the potato lid had gone the colour of pale amber, and the edges had begun to pull away from the sides of the pot. But before all that patience, there was Sunday, and after Sunday, there was Monday, and the joint coming to the table cold. Thin slices of beef or lamb, the fat set now into a white rim at the edge, arranged on a plate with iceberg lettuce, half a tomato, a few slices of cucumber, and a generous spoonful of Heinz salad cream, that pale, tangy, vinegary dressing that had been on British tables since 1914, and which bore no resemblance to actual cream, but tasted exactly right with cold meat. Boiled potatoes from the night before, reheated or cold depending on the household's rules. No cooking required. The whole weekly rhythm built around that joint. Roast on Sunday, cold meat on Monday, soup from the bones on Tuesday, was a masterclass in making one piece of meat feed several meals without anyone feeling hard done by. She sliced it herself, always across the grain, always thin enough to eat without a knife. That is information that went with her. They made black pudding from pig's blood, mixed with oatmeal or barley, chopped pork fat, onion and spices, filled into casings and poached until set into that firm, dark, almost crumbling sausage. It fried in its own fat and turned the outside into a crackling shell, while the inside stayed dense and rich. Lancashire had its version, Yorkshire had its version, and Stornoway in the Outer Hebrides had its own recipe, which the locals would tell you was the only real one. The old saying was that you could eat every part of a pig except its squeal, and black pudding was proof, taking what had been a waste product of slaughter and making something so full of flavour that it became what many people claim to miss most about a proper cooked breakfast. In the 1960s, it was a Tuesday or a Saturday morning, fried alongside a rasher and an egg, eaten before work or on the weekend when time allowed. The blood was what made it. That was the whole point. And now that most people don't want to think about where food comes from, the blood has become the reason they don't eat it. The cauliflower went into salted boiling water and came out tender, not completely soft, just done, with a little resistance still in the thicker stalks. Drained into a buttered dish, a thick bechamel poured over, strong cheddar grated on top, and then under the grill until the cheese bubbled and blistered and the edges of the cauliflower that poked up through the sauce began to colour. 1 pan for the cauliflower, 1 pan for the sauce, 10 minutes under the grill. A complete meal for one that tasted far more substantial than the ingredients suggested. In the 1960s, cauliflower was a winter vegetable, available when other produce was scarce, and it carried something of that season in its flavour, slightly sulphurous when boiled, transformed into something rich and satisfying once the cheese sauce had its way. She made it without measuring the milk or the flour. She made the sauce by feel, stirring until it was right by instinct rather than instruction. That is not a skill that can be read from a recipe card, and it is not a skill that was ever written down. Pig's heart or lamb's heart, both worked, though lamb's was smaller, better for one person cooking alone. You trimmed the fat, cut away the tough valves and chambers, and stuffed the cavity with breadcrumbs, onion, sage, and a knob of softened dripping to hold it together. Secured with a skewer, browned in fat, then half submerged in stock, and left to braise in a low oven for an hour and a half. Long enough for the muscle to soften from something requiring a strong knife into something that sliced cleanly, giving up its juices to the braising liquid which reduced into a thin, intensely savoury gravy. People who had grown up eating this through rationing knew it as cheap, reliable, nourishing. It required no expensive ingredient and considerable knowledge about how long to braise, what temperature to use, and when to check the liquid. That knowledge has almost entirely disappeared from the domestic kitchen. The hearts sit unsold in the butcher's case now. 30 dishes. 30 kitchens that went quiet. If one of them was yours, leave its name below. Someone else remembers it too.